Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the star of our show, Terry.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Music and Me. I'm your host, Terry, and today we are diving into one of the most exciting times of year for Broadway fans, Tony Awards season. I always get so excited when the Tony nominations are announced because it's such a fun way to celebrate everything happening on Broadway. It's a chance to discover new musicals, celebrate incredible performances, and see what shows audiences and critics have been talking about all year long. There's just something magical about award season in the theater world. And honestly, this year feels especially unique because there is such a wide variety of shows nominated. We have original musicals, movie and television adaptations, jukebox musicals, and classic revivals being completely reinvented for modern audiences. Broadway is constantly changing and evolving, and I think this is one of the reasons theater stays so exciting. Every single year, creative people find new ways to tell stories, bring fresh ideas to the stage, and reimagine classics in ways nobody expects. Now, I'm going to be completely honest with all of you. I don't know a lot about many of the musicals nominated this year, but honestly, this is part of why I wanted to do this episode and why I do it every year. One of my favorite things about doing episodes like this is getting the chance to learn about Broadway shows that I may not have heard of before. There are those musicals that completely fly under my radar. And then Tony season comes around, and suddenly I'm listening to songs from cast recordings, watching performances online, reading about the stories, and becoming completely fascinated by all of these shows. I love that the Tony Awards introduced me to musicals I might not have discovered otherwise. So today, we are going to focus specifically on the nominees for Best Musical and Best Revival of a Musical. We're going to talk about what these shows are about, why people are so excited about them, and what makes each one stand out this Broadway season. And of course, the 79th Tony Awards will take place on June 7th at the legendary Radio City Music Hall, which honestly just makes everything feel even more exciting and glamorous. So grab your playbill, turn up the show tunes, and let's head to Broadway because it's time to talk about this year's Tony nominees. Now that we've set the stage, let's jump right into this year's nominees for Best Musical, because this category is honestly so interesting. One thing that immediately stood out to me when I looked at the nominees this year is just how completely different all of these shows are from each other. There's not really one single type of musical dominating Broadway right now, and I actually love that. It shows how creative and unpredictable theater can be. The nominees for Best Musical this year are The Lost Boys, Schmigadoon, Titaníque, and Two Strangers Carry a Cake Across New York. And just hearing those titles together already tells you how wild and varied this Broadway season has been. We have a vampire thriller turned musical. We have a television comedy adaptation that celebrates classic musicals. We have a parody built around the music of Celine Dion. And then we have a romantic comedy about two strangers meeting in New York City. That is such a fun mix of stories and styles. And honestly, I think this lineup says a lot about what Broadway audiences love right now. People seem to really enjoy nostalgia, shows that remind them of movies, television shows, music, or stories they already know and love. There's definitely a huge interest in adaptations right now, too. Broadway keeps finding ways to take familiar stories and reinvent them for the stage in exciting ways. But what I also find interesting is that a lot of these musicals seem to balance comedy with emotion. Audiences still want stories that make them laugh and help them escape reality for a couple hours, but they also want heart and emotional connection at the same time. Sometimes people just want to sit in the theater, laugh, get swept up in a story, and leave feeling happy or inspired. That has always been one of the most magical things about musicals to me. So let's start breaking these nominees down one by one because some of these shows sound absolutely fascinating. Let's start with The Lost Boys, which may honestly be one of the most surprising nominees in this entire category. If the title sounds familiar, that's because this musical is based on the classic 1987 vampire movie, The Lost Boys. The original film became a huge cult favorite because it mixed humor, comedy, teenage rebellion, and that very stylish, dark 1980s atmosphere all together. The story follows two brothers, Michael and Sam, who move with their mother to a small California beach town after their parents get divorced. At first, the town seems cool and exciting, but then they discover something terrifying. The town is filled with vampires. Michael starts falling under the influence of a dangerous vampire gang led by David, and suddenly the story becomes this mix of humor, suspense, action, and family drama. That already feels like something that would work really well as a musical because the story is so dramatic and theatrical. And from everything I've read and heard about this Broadway version, it really leans into the darker rock-inspired sound. Instead of feeling like a traditional bright Broadway musical, this show sounds more edgy and atmospheric. I can imagine powerful rock vocals, dramatic lighting, intense choreography, and huge visual moments with the vampires. Horror musicals can work surprisingly well on stage when they're done right. Theater is already such a dramatic art form, so adding suspense, darkness, and larger than life visuals can make everything feel even more exciting. Broadway productions today can create incredible effects with lighting, projections, sets, and choreography, so I can only imagine how visually stunning some of the vampire scenes in this show must be. I also think vampire stories continue connecting with audiences because they mix fantasy with emotion. A lot of vampire stories are really about identity, loneliness, temptation, power, and wanting to belong. Even though they are supernatural stories, there are still very human emotions underneath all of it. And let's be honest, audiences have always loved vampires. I know I have. What is really impressive is that The Lost Boys is tied for the most Tony nominations this year with 12 nominations overall, which is huge. That tells me this is not just a fun adaptation people are enjoying. Sounds like Broadway voters really took this show seriously. This might actually feel like one of the front runners to win Best Musical. It already has a recognizable title that draws audiences in, but it also seems like the creative team found a way to turn it into a true theatrical experience instead of just copying the movie scene for scene. The idea of a dark vampire rock musical on Broadway just really sounds incredibly fun to me. Now, moving from vampires to something completely different, let's talk about Schmigadoon, which honestly sounds like an absolute love letter to musical theater. This show actually started as a television series, which already makes it stand out from a lot of Broadway musicals. The TV version became really popular with theater fans, including me, because it was created specifically to celebrate and parody classic musicals from Broadway's golden age. And now it has made the jump from television to the Broadway stage, which honestly feels kind of perfect considering the entire show is already about musical theater. The story follows a modern couple who end up trapped in a magical musical town called Schmigadoon, where everyone behaves like they're living inside a classic 1940s or 1950s Broadway musical. That would be my dream come true. I would love to get stuck in a musical. The only way they can leave is by finding true love, which of course leads to all kinds of hilarious musical theater chaos. What makes Schmigadoon especially interesting is how it celebrates classic Broadway while also gently making fun of it at the same time. The show is filled with references to old school musicals, the big dance numbers, overly cheerful townspeople, dramatic romances, and those huge golden age style songs that sound straight out of the era of Rodgers and Hammerstein. But it never sounds mean spirited. It feels more like a tribute than a joke. And I think that is why musical theater fans especially love this kind of show. If you are someone who grew up loving classic musicals, you probably recognize so many little references and inside jokes throughout the show. It sounds like one of those musicals where theater fans are constantly pointing at the stage going, "Oh my gosh, I know what that is referencing." I also think it's really interesting that modern audiences seem to be rediscovering classic musical styles lately. Even though Broadway keeps evolving, there is still something timeless about those older musicals with huge melodies, romantic stories, colorful characters, and big ensemble dance numbers. What I love about Schmigadoon is that it seems to understand that you can parody something while still deeply loving it. The show pokes fun at some of the sillier traditions of older musicals, but it also celebrates why those musicals become classics in the first place. Comedy and tribute can absolutely exist together. The Broadway version also features some really talented performers, along with a cast filled with major musical theater talent. And clearly, Broadway voters loved it because Schmigadoon also received 12 Tony nominations this year, tying the Lost Boys for the most nominations overall. Now, do I think a comedy can win Best Musical? Sometimes comedy musicals get underestimated because people tend to think dramatic shows are more serious award contenders. But comedy is incredibly hard to do well, especially in musical theater. Making audiences laugh while still delivering strong music, storytelling, and heart is not easy at all. And honestly, if audiences leave the theater smiling and having an amazing time, that matters too. This feels like one of those shows that probably reminds people why they fell in love with musicals in the first place. And that can be very powerful during awards season. Now, I loved the show Schmigadoon, so I really want to see this musical. And I can't wait for the cast recording to come out. Hopefully, it will come out soon. Now we're going from classic musical comedy to something that honestly might be the most completely chaotic and over the top show in this entire category, Titaníque. And I have to say, the second I heard the concept for this musical, I immediately understood why people are obsessed with it. So, Titaníque takes the story of Titanic, yes, that Titanic, and mixes it with the music of Celine Dion. And apparently, the entire story is told through Celine herself retelling what really happened aboard the Titanic. Honestly, that premise alone sounds absolutely wild in the best possible way. This is not meant to be a serious, dramatic retelling of the movie. Instead, it fully leans into comedy, parody, camp, and complete theatrical chaos. It takes this iconic emotional film that so many people know by heart and turns it into this hilarious musical experience packed with Celine Dion songs. I think one reason the show has become so popular is because audiences really love campy, over the top musicals right now. People love shows that know exactly what they are and fully commit to the bit. Titanique does not sound like it is trying to be subtle at all. It sounds loud, ridiculous, dramatic, self aware, and completely unapologetic. I've seen clips, and that is so true. Sometimes that is exactly what audiences want. I also think nostalgia plays a huge role in why this musical connects with people. So many audiences already have emotional connections to both the movie Titanic and Celine Dion's music. Songs like My Heart Will Go On are already tied to huge emotions and memories for people. So the musical gets to play with that nostalgia while also making audiences laugh. That balance between comedy and nostalgia can be really powerful. And this show has apparently developed a huge cult following because audiences seem to absolutely love the experience of seeing it live. From everything I've heard, people leave the theater laughing nonstop because this show just keeps getting more outrageous as it goes on. I feel like this is one of those musicals where the audience energy probably becomes part of the fun. This is also a really good example of why jukebox musicals continue to be so successful on Broadway. Audiences love hearing familiar music. There is something exciting about hearing songs you already know and love used in a completely new story or context. And when these songs are attached to an artist as iconic as Celine Dion, people already come into the theater emotionally connected to the music. Now, just like we talked about with Schmigadoon, I do think comedy musicals sometimes get underestimated during award season. Sometimes people assume that if a show is funny, it is somehow less impressive artistically, which is not fair at all because comedy is incredibly difficult to pull off successfully. And I should know because I'm a very funny person. And honestly, making audiences genuinely laugh for 2 hours is a huge achievement. What really makes Titaníque stand out in this category is how fearless it sounds. Compared to the darker tone of The Lost Boys or the classic musical references in Schmigadoon, this musical feels like it is embracing pure theatrical absurdity. It sounds like a show that fully understands how fun and ridiculous theater can be. Broadway needs shows like that too. Not every musical has to be serious and emotional all the time. Sometimes audiences just want to laugh, sing along to familiar songs, and enjoy a night of complete theatrical madness. And Titanic sounds like it delivers exactly that. And finally, let's talk about Two Strangers Carry a Cake Across New York, which is probably the nominee I knew the least about before the Tony nominations were announced. And this is exactly why I love doing episodes like this, because I discover shows that I may never have looked at otherwise. The title alone caught my attention because it sounds quirky, sweet, and very New York all at the same time, and you know how I love New York. And after learning more about this musical and listening to the cast recording, this musical sounds completely different from the big spectacle shows that we've already talked about. While shows like The Lost Boys and Titanic sound huge, flashy, and over the top, Two Strangers Carry a Cake Across New York seems much smaller, more personal, and more emotionally intimate. The story follows two strangers who meet in New York City and end up spending time together while carrying a cake across the city. That setup already feels like the beginning of a romantic comedy movie that you would immediately want to watch. It sounds like one of those stories where two very different people unexpectedly connect, and through their conversations and experiences together, they slowly start learning more about each other, and probably themselves too. And New York City itself feels like a character in musicals like this. There is something about New York that works perfectly for storytelling. It is busy, emotional, chaotic, romantic, exciting, overwhelming, sometimes all at once. Broadway has always had a special relationship with New York because theater and the city are so connected to each other. Some of the most iconic musicals ever used New York as part of the emotional atmosphere of their story. And this show sounds like it really embraces that energy. What I find especially interesting is that this musical seems to rely more on character and emotion rather than giant spectacle. It sounds like the focus is really on the relationship between these two people and the emotional journey they go on together. And honestly, I think there is something really beautiful about smaller character driven musicals. Not every Broadway show needs giant sets, huge special effects, or massive dance numbers to connect with audiences. Sometimes the most powerful thing can simply be two characters having honest conversations and forming a connection that audiences emotionally invest in. I also think audiences naturally connect with stories about strangers meeting because there is something hopeful about them. Those stories remind us that random encounters can change our lives in unexpected ways. There is something romantic and exciting about the idea that one conversation with a stranger could completely alter your perspective or your future. And in a Broadway season filled with adaptations, revivals, and recognizable titles, I think it's really important that original musicals like this still exist. They allow new stories, new writers, and new voices to have space alongside the bigger commercial productions. Now, do smaller musicals have a harder time competing against giant spectacle shows during award season? Probably yes, sometimes. Big productions naturally attract attention because they are visually impressive and easier to market. But smaller musicals can absolutely surprise people if the storytelling and emotional connection are strong enough. Sometimes audiences remember how a show made them feel more than how big the sets were. And the more I learn about Two Strangers, the more curious I become about it because it sounds heartfelt, charming, emotional, and very human. And those kinds of stories can leave a lasting impact too. All right, everyone. I do apologize. I feel like this one's going to run a little long, but let's move on to the nominees for Best Revival of a Musical. And honestly, this category might be even more exciting to me because these are shows I've actually heard of before. But some of those productions are taking such different approaches to original musicals that it makes everything feel fresh and brand new again. I think that's one of the coolest things about revivals. A revival is not just about bringing an old musical back to the stage exactly the way it was before. Modern Broadway revivals often completely reinvent familiar stories. Directors and creative teams take classic musicals and look at them through a new lens, whether that means changing the visual style, updating the themes, reimagining choreography, or finding entirely new emotional meanings inside the material. Revivals today feel much more experimental than they used to. Years ago, a revival might have focused mostly on recreating the original production as closely as possible. But now, Broadway directors seem much more interested in asking questions like, how can we make this story feel new again? Or, how can we introduce this musical to a younger generation in a completely different way? And I love that because it means classic musicals continue evolving instead of feeling stuck in the past. Revivals also give newer audiences a chance to experience legendary shows they may never have had the opportunity to see before. Not everybody got to see the original productions of these musicals. So revivals helps keep the stories alive for future generations of theater fans. And this year's revival nominees are such an interesting mix because they are all very different from each other. The nominees for Best Revival of a Musical are Cats, the Jellicle Ball, Ragtime, and Richard O'Brien's The Rocky Horror Show. And honestly, just hearing those three titles together feels like musical theater chaos in the best possible way. We have a completely reimagined version of Cats, one of Broadway's most legendary and divisive musicals. We have the emotional and historical musical Ragtime. And then we have the cult phenomenon, The Rocky Horror Show, which has been shocking and entertaining audiences for decades. And what makes this category especially exciting is that these productions are not simply trying to recreate the originals. They sound like they're trying to reinterpret them in bold and creative ways. First, let's talk about Cats, the Jellicle Ball, which might be one of the most fascinating revivals Broadway has seen in a long time. And if you have listened to the Music and Me before, you probably know that I already did an entire episode about the original Cats musical because it's one of those legendary Broadway shows that people have very strong opinions about. People either absolutely love Cats or they're completely confused by it. And that has kind of always been part of the show's identity. The original musical, created by Andrew Lloyd Webber, became one of the biggest Broadway phenomena of all time. It is based on T.S. Eliot poems about a group of cats called the Jellicles gathering for one magical night where one cat is chosen to be reborn. And while the plot has always been a little unusual and abstract, the music, dancing, costumes, and theatrical spectacle made it unforgettable for audiences. Songs like Memory became absolutely iconic. But what makes Cats, the Jellicle Ball, so exciting is that this revival does not sound interested in simply recreating the original production. Instead, it completely reimagines the show through the influence of ballroom culture. which honestly sounds incredibly creative and fresh. Ballroom culture, which became especially known through Black and Latino LGBTQ plus communities, is filled with dance, fashion, performance, competition, self expression, and larger than life energy. It is bold, glamorous, emotional, and theatrical, which fits surprisingly well within the world of Cats. And from everything I've heard and seen, this version transforms the musical into something that feels very modern, vibrant, and completely alive in a new way. This is exactly what I was talking about earlier when I said revivals today are becoming much more experimental. Instead of asking, how do we recreate the original Cats? This creative team seemed to have asked, how can we reinvent Cats so audiences experience it differently? And I love that approach because whether people love or dislike the original Cats, you cannot deny that it takes risks. And this revival sounds like it is continuing that same spirit of theatrical boldness. I also think this is a perfect example of why Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals continue surviving across generations. His shows are often huge theatrical experiences with memorable music, dramatic visuals, and very strong atmospheres. Even decades later, directors keep finding new ways to reinterpret his work because the material leaves room for creativity and imagination. Cats has always been one of Broadway's most divisive musicals. Some people think it is brilliant and magical. Other people watch it and go, what on earth is happening right now? But maybe that is part of why it continues lasting for so long. People keep talking about it. And I think there is something really exciting about taking a classic musical and boldly reinventing it instead of trying to copy the original exactly. Sometimes recreating an old production can feel safe, but reinterpretations can make audiences see the story in a completely new light. This revival has also been praised for its creativity and fresh perspective, which tells me that this new version is really connecting with audiences and critics. The more I hear about this version of Cats, the more fun it sounds. It feels energetic, daring, stylish, emotional, and completely different from the version that most people think of when they hear the title Cats. And that is exactly what makes modern revivals so exciting. Now let's talk about the revival that I have personally been the most obsessed with since these nominations were announced, Ragtime. And in truth, I've been obsessed with it before because I've listened to the cast recordings several times, and it stars one of my favorite Broadway actresses, Casey Levy, who was in Frozen. I feel like this is one of those musicals where even if you don't know the full story yet, the music alone can completely pull you in emotionally. That's exactly what happened to me. I've been listening to songs from Ragtime, and the music is just absolutely powerful. There is something so emotional, sweeping, and dramatic about the score that immediately grabs your attention. The songs feel huge and heartfelt in a way that really stays with you. This is a musical that I could absolutely see myself doing an entire future episode about because the more I learn about it, the more fascinated I become with it. For those who may not know much about it, like me, Ragtime is set in early 1900s America and follows several different interconnected stories. It focuses on people from very different backgrounds whose lives slowly become connected during a time of enormous social change in the country. The musical explores themes of racism, immigration, class inequality, hope, ambition, and the idea of chasing the American dream. It follows characters including Colehouse Walker Jr., a talented Black musician fighting against racism and injustice, Tata, a Jewish immigrant trying to build a better life for his daughter, and a wealthy upper-class white family whose lives become connected to both of them. The more I read about this story, the more I understand why this musical has had such a lasting impact on theater fans. Even though it's set over 100 years ago, the themes still feel incredibly relevant today. Issues involving race, inequality, immigration, identity, and social division are still conversations we continue having in society right now. And I think that's part of what makes historical musicals so powerful. They remind us that history is not as distant from the present as we sometimes think it is. Theater has this incredible ability to make history feel personal and emotional instead of just something you read about in a textbook. And serious musicals like Ragtime often connect very strongly with Tony voters because they feel emotionally important and artistically ambitious. These kinds of shows tend to leave audiences thinking deeply long after they leave the theater. But what makes Ragtime especially impressive is that it is not just emotionally heavy, it is also filled with stunning music. The score blends different styles of music from the time period, including ragtime, gospel, jazz, and traditional musical theater sounds, which gives the show this huge emotional richness. And clearly, this revival is making a major impact because it received 11 Tony nominations overall, which is incredibly impressive. I also think this revival proves why musicals become timeless classics. People still want stories about hope, justice, change, and fighting for a better future. And this revival might actually be the favorite to win Best Revival of a Musical. It has the emotional weight that awards voters often love. It tackles important themes. It has a legendary score. And it sounds like this production has already moved audiences in a powerful way. And the more I hear about this revival, the more I want to experience the entire show for myself because it sounds emotional, inspiring, heartbreaking, and incredibly meaningful all at once. Now let's talk about our final nominee for Best Revival of a Musical, Richard O'Brien's The Rocky Horror Show. And this one is the ultimate cult musical in this category. Even if someone has never seen it live, chances are they have at least heard of it because Rocky Horror has been part of pop culture for decades. It started as a stage musical created by Richard O'Brien, and it quickly grew into something way bigger than just a theater production. It became a full cultural phenomenon. And what makes it so legendary is its cult following. This is not just a show people go to and quietly watch from their seats. Rocky Horror is known for its audience participation traditions, where fans come dressed as characters, shout lines back at the stage, dance along, and fully become part of the experience. It turns theater into something interactive, chaotic, and honestly kind of electric. And that kind of energy is exactly why this musical has survived for so long. The story itself is a wild mix of sci-fi horror, comedy, and complete theatrical absurdity. It follows Brad and Janet, a very innocent couple who end up stranded and stumble into the strange world of Dr. Frankenfurter, who is definitely one of the most iconic and outrageous characters in musical theater history. But beyond the story, what really matters is what the show represents: freedom, rebellion, self expression, and not fitting into traditional rules or expectations. And I think that's a big reason why it continues to connect with audiences even today. There's something really powerful about a show that encourages people to let go of judgment and just fully be themselves for a couple hours. And I think that's also why Rocky Horror has remained culturally relevant for decades. Every generation seems to rediscover it in a slightly different way. For some people, it is their first introduction to cult theater. For others, it's a long-time tradition where they go back again and again because no two performers feel exactly the same due to audience participation. That interactive experience is such a big part of its legacy. It is not just about watching a story, it's about being inside the story. And that creates a kind of loyalty and fandom that very few musicals ever achieve. But I also think that reviving a show like this is a huge challenge. When something is already this iconic and tied to audience traditions, there's always the question of how much can you change without losing what people love about it? Do you try to modernize it? Do you preserve the original tone? Or do you lean fully into what makes it chaotic and beloved? And I think modern audiences probably experience Rocky Horror a little different than past generations do. Earlier audiences may have discovered it as something edgy and shocking for its time. But today, audiences might see it more as a celebration of theater history, queer expression, and cult fandom culture, while still appreciating how bold and unconventional it was when it first appeared. And that is what makes it so fascinating in this revival category. It's not just a musical, it's an experience, a tradition, and a community all in one. Now, I want to say I read something that the old musical had a lot of audience participation, but in this new version, they don't encourage that, is what I heard. I could be wrong, but I think I read that they don't like all that shouting and stuff while they're performing. Now, let's get to my favorite part of the episode, predictions and personal favorites, because this is where everything gets really fun and also a little emotional for me. Starting with Best Musical, I really feel like this is going to come down to The Lost Boys or Schmigadoon. Both of them have had such a strong buzz, and both feel like very different kinds of Tony winners. But if I'm being completely honest about my gut feeling, I think The Lost Boys might just take that Tony. And I say that mostly because it feels like the kind of show that checks a lot of Tony boxes. It's bold, it's visually huge, it's based on a recognizable story, and it has that darker, rock-driven theatrical energy that tends to stand out in award seasons. Even though I would absolutely love to see a comedy like Schmigadoon win, I just don't know if a comedy musical can pull off the top prize this year as much as I want it to. And I really do want it to because Schmigadoon feels like such a joyful celebration of musical theater, and I love the music and I loved the TV show. For Best Revival, I really think Ragtime is the one to beat. And I don't say that lightly because all three revivals this year are so creatively interesting in their own ways. But Ragtime just feels like it has that emotional weight, that sweeping score, and that timeless storytelling that Tony voters tend to respond to in a really strong way. It feels powerful, important, and unforgettable. That being said, I also think Cats, the Jellicle Ball is one of the most creatively daring revivals I have seen described in a long time. And the Rocky Horror Show brings that iconic cult energy that's impossible to ignore. But my instinct keeps coming back to Ragtime. Now, I want to talk about a couple of the shows that did not get nominated this year because there are always a few that leave you surprised or even frustrated. And one of them for me is chess. I really expected to see chess show up in the revival category, especially with how iconic the score is and how much theater fans talk about it. But the one that I am honestly still a little emotional about is Beaches. I really wanted to see Beaches get recognized this year, especially because it starred one of my absolute favorite Broadway performers, Jessica Vosk. I was really hoping she would at least get a nomination because she is such a powerhouse performer, and I feel like she brings so much emotion and energy to every role she plays. And it makes it even more bittersweet knowing that Beaches recently closed on Broadway on May 24th, earlier than expected. It just felt like one of those shows that I wanted to see get a bigger moment in the spotlight before it ended its run. So that one definitely stands out to me as a disappointment from this Tony season. I also heard that Chess is closing early. So both of the musicals that didn't get nominated that I thought were going to get nominated both closed early, which is sad. Now, when I think about the shows I personally want to see from everything we've talked about today, my top three would probably be Ragtime, The Lost Boys, and Schmigadoon. Those three feel like the most exciting mix to me. Ragtime for the emotional storytelling and music, The Lost Boys for the big theatrical spectacle and energy, and Schmigadoon for the pure love of musical theater and comedy. And I think those are the kinds of shows that people will still be talking about years from now in completely different ways. Ragtime because of its emotional depth, The Lost Boys because of its bold reinvention, and Schmigadoon because of how much joy and nostalgia it brings to musical theater fans. And that is really what makes Tony season so exciting every year. Even when you're not familiar with all the shows at first, like I wasn't with some of these, you end up discovering new musicals, new sounds, and new stories that stick with you long after the awards are over. And that brings us to the end of this Tony Awards deep dive. I'm sorry if this episode was a little longer than normal, but you know how I love musical theater. I do have to say that this episode was such a fun one for me because I went into it not knowing a lot about some of these musicals, and I'm coming out of it feeling like I have discovered a whole new list of shows that I really want to listen to, learn more about, and hopefully see one day. That is honestly one of my favorite things about Broadway. There's always something new to explore. Every season brings completely different kinds of stories, whether it's big spectacle musicals, emotional historical pieces, comedy-filled parodies, or intimate character-driven stories. And somehow, they all find their place on the same stage. And I think that's what makes the Tony Awards so exciting every year. It's not just about winning or losing. It's about celebrating how creative, diverse, and alive musical theater really is right now. From vampires and cult classics, to ballroom-inspired reimaginings, to sweeping historical dramas, to two strangers just trying to connect in New York City, this year's nominees really show us just how many different directions Broadway is heading in. And I love that. I cannot wait to see what happens at the Tony Awards on June 7th, 2026 at Radio City Music Hall, hosted by Pink, by the way, and I will definitely be watching close to see if my predictions are right or completely off. And if you're like me and are still discovering some of them for the first time, then maybe this episode gave you a few new musicals to check out as well. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today on The Music and Me. I will be back for another episode full of music, Broadway, and everything in between. Until then, keep listening, keep discovering, and keep loving the music in you. Peace out, everybody. This has been the Music and Me podcast. Subscribe now so you don't miss a beat.
This has been